To date, the U.S. Congress has passed 4 aid packages for Ukraine, totaling $113 billion to help the country defend itself during the quote, premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified war waged against it by Russia. But what if this number stops at 4? What would happen if the U.S. stopped giving aid to Ukraine? The answer to the question depends on who you ask. If they aren't an opponent of the U.S., the answer will be nothing good. Even that answer might be an understatement. Many experts put it this way: either the U.S. supports Ukraine or Ukraine loses the war. But given how fiercely Ukraine has fought back against Russia and how much Europe has rallied around the country, it's only natural to wonder if this is true. You might also wonder why we're talking about a withdrawal of aid in the first place. After all, didn't President Joe Biden promise that the U.S. will support Ukraine's fight against Russia for as long as it takes? These are all fair questions that'll be answered by the end of this video. But before we can answer these questions, we need to examine closely the aid package itself. It's the only way to understand its critical role in sustaining Ukraine's resilience against Russia. Let's start by defining the key players and notions. Aid for Ukraine comes from the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Given the scope and the amount of aid directed to Ukraine, these efforts must be closely and rigorously monitored. That's the job of the Ukraine Oversight Interagency Working Group. This working group serves as a whole-of-government coordinating body consisting of over 160 officials monitoring 20 federal oversight agencies. Now, it's also important to define what kind of aid the U.S. provides to Ukraine. In one corner, there's direct budget support for the Ukrainian government directed at non-security general budget expenses, such as salaries for civil servants and pensions. These funds flow directly into the Ukrainian government's budget through the World Bank and have allowed Ukraine to keep its government afloat during the economic stress caused by wartime. The first contribution of this kind was made in April 2022, totaling $500 million. Since then, the total amount of economic aid to Ukraine has reached around $13 billion. In addition to economically, the U.S. supports Ukraine militarily as well. This is also by far the most substantial portion of the U.S. aid to Ukraine, totaling nearly $44 billion, according to the U.S. State Department. There are 2 ways in which the military aid is delivered to Ukraine. First, Biden relies on his executive powers, known as the Presidential Drawdown Authority, to quickly ship existing weapons to Ukraine, including armored vehicles and missiles from the U.S. military stockpiles. Biden has used this power on 44 occasions since August 2021, drawing approximately $23.8 billion worth of equipment from the Department of Defense stockpiles. As for the second, it includes manufacturing new arms and ammunition for Ukraine, covered by the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. But what kind of arms and ammunition are we talking about? Let's do a quick rundown of the most notable military equipment the U.S. has pledged to Ukraine. In the Air Defense Department, Ukraine has received some of the following equipment: 12 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, NASAMS, with munitions, Hawk Air Defense Systems with munitions, over 2,000 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, AIM-7, RIM-7, and AIM-9M missiles for air defense, Vampire anti-drone systems with munitions, Avenger air defense systems, 21 air surveillance radars. Ukraine has also received the equipment necessary to integrate Western air defense components with Ukraine systems, as well as the equipment for supporting Ukraine's existing capabilities in this department. Ukraine's air defense was also strengthened with unmanned aerial systems like the Switchblade, Phoenix Ghost, Cyberlux K-8, Altius 600, Jump 20, and Hornet. Next up, firearms. Here we can also see some impressive numbers and even more impressive weapons, including the following: 39 high-mobility artillery rocket systems with ammunition, ground-launched small-diameter bomb, GLSDB launchers and guided rockets, over 270 howitzers, and over 2,800,000 artillery rounds, 60,000 Grad rockets, over 30,000 rounds of remote anti-armor mine or RAM systems, over 7,000 precision-guided 155mm artillery rounds, over 290,000 of various other artillery rounds, over 400,000 mortar rounds, over 200 various mortar systems, over 70 counter-artillery and counter-mortar radars, 20 multi-mission radars. The U.S. also included smaller weapons, sending thousands of grenades and grenade launchers, small arms and small arms ammunition, rocket launchers, systems, and munitions. To aid in ground maneuvers, Ukraine has been equipped with the following: 31 Abrams and 45 T-72B tanks, including ammunition, 186 Bradley fighting vehicles, 189 Stryker and 300 M113 armored personnel carriers, 250 M1117 armored security vehicles, over 500 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles or MRAPs, over 2,000 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles HMMWVs, 300 armored medical treatment vehicles, over 200 light tactical vehicles, 80 trucks, 124 trailers, and 800 tactical vehicles for heavy equipment. So far, we've covered 2 military branches, the Army and the Air Force. That leaves us with the Navy. Since the conflict at sea is less prevalent, the U.S. has sent the limited following maritime equipment to Ukraine: 62 coastal and riverine patrol boats, 2 Harpoon coastal defense systems and anti-ship missiles, unmanned coastal defense vessels, port and harbor security equipment. From other important military capabilities, the U.S. has packaged the following: over 100,000 sets of body armor and helmets, C4 explosives and demolition equipment for obstacle clearing, night vision devices, surveillance and thermal imagery systems, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear protective equipment, medical supplies including first aid kits. One look at these lists is enough to explain how Ukraine has been able to resist Russia for so long. But the success of U.S. aid in Ukraine also raises a question: why would it stop? The answer to this question boils down to a rather complex set of factors. One significant concern that could jeopardize the U.S.'s commitment is the diminishing public support for providing aid to Ukraine. In a poll carried out by CNN in August 2023, the majority of Americans, 55% to be exact, expressed opposition to funding Ukraine any further. The erosion of support can be attributed to the length of the conflict, which entered its 17th month when the poll in question was conducted. To make matters worse, international support for Ukraine has seen an even sharper decline. According to the Kiel Institute, this support fell almost 90% between August and October 2023, adding another layer of uncertainty to Ukraine's prospects for continued assistance. Even some of Ukraine's most ardent supporters appear to be split by other crises, notably the war in Gaza. But to identify the biggest impediment to U.S. assistance to Ukraine, we must direct our attention to the institution whose job it is to approve most of these funds, the U.S. Congress. As 2023 nears its end, it appears that Congress has no intention of passing new aid packages for Ukraine. That is, until the White House considers some compromises on immigration policies. Basically, Republicans are using Ukraine aid as a bargaining chip to pass their immigration reform proposals for the U.S. southern border. This comes much to the dismay of those recognizing the potentially catastrophic consequences of withholding Ukraine aid. Naturally, one of these people is the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who visited the U.S. Congress in mid-December, hoping to change the minds of the GOP members and get them to approve the new aid package. Unfortunately, his appeal failed to sway Republican lawmakers, who left the meeting with Zelensky unmoved. They reiterated that the aid to Ukraine will be contingent on the Democrats and the Biden administration meeting their demands for stricter immigration measures. Though the Biden administration remains hopeful of finding a resolution, as you'll hear later, the current situation isn't exactly promising, casting doubt on whether Biden will be able to keep his promise to help Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. So many hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. With this in mind, let's discuss what would happen if the U.S. stopped giving aid to Ukraine. First, we must define what "stop giving aid" means under current circumstances. It means the U.S. Congress wouldn't fund a new aid package to Ukraine, effectively cutting off any future economic or humanitarian aid. It doesn't, however, mean that Ukraine would be left high and dry overnight. Luckily, there are certain areas where Ukraine still has some breathing space, which was, of course, facilitated by the U.S. For instance, Biden still has roughly $5.6 billion in military materials and equipment to direct toward Ukraine under previous spending bills passed by Congress. Interestingly, a Pentagon accounting error made this possible by overvaluing the aid that Ukraine had previously received. The Defense Department will primarily use the $5.6 billion to deliver items like HIMARS missiles, tactical vehicles, and ammunition. If you aren't sure how far this amount of money could go, we'll put things into perspective. A $500 million defense assistance package in June 2023 was enough to support Ukraine's counteroffensive operations and significantly strengthen its air defenses. This package contained key military equipment, such as Bradley fighting vehicles for mobility and Stryker combat vehicles for enhanced firepower, multiple launch rocket systems, anti-tank weapons, air defense, and precision aerial munitions. anti-radar missiles, and artillery. In other words, with the $5.6 billion in military equipment, Ukraine will be set militarily for quite some time. But is this enough? In a word, no. After all, there's still economic and humanitarian aid to consider. Pulling the plug on these would have disastrous effects on Ukraine, its people, and its military in the long run. Plus, the fact that the military aid will eventually run out might not cause an immediate Russian victory, but it will undoubtedly change the character of the war, as one defense analyst put it. So, what would the Ukrainian battlefield look like if the US were to stop sending aid? No one expects this move to have an immediate impact on the battlefield, but this doesn't mean there won't be any difference. Without US aid, a shift in the balance on the Ukrainian battlefield is imminent. Now, anyone following the war in Ukraine knows there's no chance its soldiers would surrender. After all, the very existence of their country is at stake. But a sharp decline in morale is to be expected, given how reliant Ukraine has become on the US aid. Of course, there is the other side to consider too. This shift in power dynamics might embolden Putin's soldiers to wreak havoc on the battlefield. Though there is no telling how things might play out in a war, some experts warn that Russian vengeance of tragic and historic proportions could take place across Ukraine. And you can only imagine what atrocities could be committed during this process. But as we've already said, Ukrainian soldiers aren't likely to just give up and let Putin's horde steamroll them on the battlefield. So what might Ukraine do to avoid this worst-case scenario? Well, some experts believe that if Ukraine loses its military dominance, the country will switch to so-called asymmetric warfare. For those who aren't familiar with this term, asymmetric warfare refers to strategies and tactics that deviate from traditional, direct confrontations between military forces of equal strength. For the most part, these include targeting the stronger force's strategy rather than the enemy itself. Without US aid, Russia would become more dominant on the battlefield, forcing Ukraine to pursue these strategies. To offset the new power imbalance, Ukraine would likely withdraw from specific sectors of the front lines into urban settlements. Interestingly, many analysts expected this scenario to take place from the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, as they didn't believe Ukraine could face off against Russia in traditional combat. Though this speaks volumes about Ukraine's tenacity, it's important to note urban combat is nothing to desire. Sure, this form of combat involves numerous logistical challenges, as the urban infrastructure can immensely hinder traditional military movements. But logistics isn't why most experts dread the possibility of urban combat. The high risk of civilian casualties is. If the battlefield were to shift to urban areas, more Ukrainian cities and towns would undoubtedly be decimated, taking countless civilian lives with them. Unfortunately, similar results would probably be seen regardless of the route Ukraine chooses. After all, the country can't make any detailed plans, with the uncertainty regarding aid hanging over its military capabilities. And if Ukraine can't make carefully thought-out military plans based on reliable US aid, it won't be able to sell them to the rest of the Western world, eroding the potential for international assistance. But this potential is far from the only aspect that would crumble should the US stop giving aid to Ukraine. So would Ukraine's already weak economy. Without US assistance, the Ukrainian government will struggle to fund both its operations and the war. All the basic functions that have kept the Ukrainian society running would gradually deteriorate, leading to more Ukrainians leaving the country and possibly even a collapse of the democratic government. These terrible consequences, paired with decimated military forces, would indicate one thing: Ukraine has lost the war. Though this is devastating all on its own, it becomes even worse when you consider the other perspective. Russia, or should we say Putin, has won. Let us tell you why this can be catastrophic for Ukraine and the rest of the world. If Putin manages to win the war in Ukraine after being on the brink of ruin on a few occasions, he will feel emboldened beyond measure. That's not to mention the bloodthirsty national patriots who've become his main source of support during the war. All of this can only mean one thing: Putin won't stop. He won't stop in Ukraine, and he won't stop outside of it. In other words, even if Ukraine was forced to surrender, many believe that Putin would continue launching attacks. Then, empowered by the defeated Ukraine, he will likely turn his attention to the weakened Europe, potentially launching attacks on other nations. Given how many times Russia has vowed revenge against Western nations that have, in its words, crossed Putin, this possibility shouldn't be taken lightly. Now, you might think that the US will step in to defend those nations, as most of them are NATO countries, and you would be right, as the US is bound by Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, stating that an armed attack against one or more of NATO countries in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. But remember what brought us to these hypothetical scenarios in the first place. No more US aid to Ukraine. Let's face it, this can be perceived as the US abandoning Ukraine in the thick of war. Just think about the message this would send to all US allies, and even worse, to all US opponents. Let's tackle the allies first. If the US abandoned Ukraine, the trust and confidence of the country's allies would likely be severely shaken. The US could easily be seen as an unreliable partner by the likes of NATO countries, Japan, and South Korea. These countries would probably start to question whether the US would truly help them in their times of need. Though all the US allies might perceive themselves as vulnerable, those with belligerent neighbors will have it the worst, especially when those neighbors in question are watching the US's every move. This brings us to the US enemies and their reaction to a potential withdrawal of aid to Ukraine. Since we've already been over Russia's potential response and mentioned belligerent neighbors to US allies, you probably know which US opponent we'll discuss next. That's right, it's China. China is closely watching the US's actions in this war in Ukraine. A potential withdrawal of aid could possibly be interpreted as a sign of wavering commitment to US allies. This, of course, could have disastrous consequences for Taiwan and the Asia-Pacific region in general. Many see a lost war in Ukraine as a stepping stone to a conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. After all, the US is arguably the only reason this war hasn't happened. And if the US is now perceived as weak and fickle, what's stopping China and the other US opponents from pursuing their interests and even targeting the US? This means that China would potentially go to war over Taiwan, viewing Ukraine's loss as an opportune moment to establish its dominance in the region. A Ukraine loss could potentially lead to a fundamental reshaping of the power dynamics at a global scale. But will the US's withdrawal of aid necessarily lead to Ukraine's loss? Could Europe step in and ensure this withdrawal doesn't end in Russia's victory and global chaos? Well, technically Europe is already helping Ukraine, so they wouldn't need to step in as much as step it up. Currently, the US is the largest individual donor of military aid to Ukraine by a margin. From late January to October 2023, the US spent roughly $47.33 billion on Ukraine's military. That's more than what the next 11 countries have donated combined. The next largest individual donor, Germany, has spent roughly $18.48 billion. The UK is in third place with around $7.09 billion. From these figures alone, it's pretty evident that matching the US's military contributions will be a Herculean task for Europe, if at all possible. Although willing, European countries couldn't physically produce as much military equipment as the US's massive military-industrial complex. Even former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen was quoted as saying, "We can't make it without a strong American commitment." But remember, this all refers to the military aid. When it comes to economic aid, things aren't as gloomy. You see, Europe is currently on track to overtake the US in terms of economic aid to Ukraine. But just like that, we're back at the bad news. First, the opponents of European economic aid to Ukraine are growing bolder as the uncertainty over the US aid intensifies. This could best be seen mere hours after the European Union agreed to open membership talks with Ukraine. Namely, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán blocked a $54 billion aid package for Ukraine. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone familiar with the politics of Orbán, who is often labeled as Putin's mouthpiece. But even if the EU countries find a way to deal with the likes of Orbán, the question remains, will European countries remain as dedicated to helping Ukraine after the US pulls out? Many believe that the answer is a resounding no. Not only that, but there's also a possibility that some countries will pull back their funding altogether if the US does the same. They might see the US's move as admitting defeat and think, why waste money on a failing effort? Even while the US aid is still going to Ukraine, some European countries have demonstrated fatigue with the war efforts. For instance, the newly elected Slovakian government has pulled its support for Ukraine altogether. The Netherlands' support has also been brought into question, following the electoral victory of right-wing politician Geert Wilders. With the US gone, other countries might follow suit, especially when you consider that Europe had already turned a blind eye to Russian aggression before, when the country initially invaded Ukraine in 2014. Though some European officials are aware that Europe can't keep expecting the US to come to the rescue, not much has been done to strengthen European self-sufficiency. Even when European countries provide aid to Ukraine, the US is primarily responsible for coordinating those efforts, making it instrumental every step of the way. So we can safely say that without the US aid, Ukraine will eventually lose this war, no matter how many European countries try to stop this. This means that the only way to prevent a worst-case scenario is for the country to find a way to continue giving aid to Ukraine. But is this possible? Well, Biden's administration is currently trying to make it possible. In August 2023, Biden asked for $24 billion for Ukraine, hoping this incremental approach would be acceptable to Congress. Unfortunately, Congress has failed to act on that request before ending the fiscal year, moving the battle for aid to 2024. Biden also tried to persuade Republicans to continue giving aid to Ukraine by making some political concessions, such as taking tougher actions to restrict undocumented migration across the US-Mexico border. But this move might hinder Biden's re-election efforts in 2024. And let's face it, the only way for Ukraine to keep receiving US aid is for Biden to get re-elected as president in November 2024. After all, former President Donald Trump, who is currently leading in many presidential polls, agrees with his fellow Republicans that the money for Ukraine should be redirected to domestic priorities. Plus, he has previously promised to end the war in Ukraine in, quote, one day, presumably by cutting off aid for Ukraine and cutting a deal with Russia. So as things stand, it will take significantly more effort to keep the aid going than it would to stop it altogether, which leaves all of Europe and the world in a precarious situation. But what do you think? Will the US stop giving aid to Ukraine? And if so, will this inevitably lead to Ukraine losing the war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.